Welcome back to Haunted and Historic Australia for another episode in our Ghost series. In this episode, we take another look at our lighthouses and the ghostly stories that accompany some of them. Lighthouses are a wondrous construction, but they all had a serious purpose. Now all automated since the 1980s, nobody really resides in them anymore. They just stand there, doing their job. They get many tourists each year, but there is something eerie about a lighthouse with nobody inside. Although unmanned now, some of these lighthouses still have souls wandering around the grounds. Like our story of the South Solitary Island Lighthouse, where poor Lydia one of the daughters of the lighthouse keeper, had died from illness and been concreted in bathtubs so as her body could wait to be sent across to the mainland for burial. It was said that her ghost remained at the South Solitary Lighthouse despite her body being taken away. But Lydia isn't the only ghost said to be haunting a lighthouse in Australia. Here are a few of those stories, but there are many more. There's the story of Old Henry at the Point Hicks Lighthouse in Victoria. In 2001, a group of family members, hailed from Old Henry, gathered together at the lighthouse on the eastern shores of Victoria for a special celebration. They signed the visitors' book to record the moment and wrote "Happy Birthday" in the comments. They were joined by lighthouse keepers Rob and Amanda Coates in singing "Happy Birthday" to Old Henry. Henry, or alias Robert Grace Christophan, was 100 years old, although he only lived to 46. But it was very much known that for the last 54 years, Old Henry was still at Point Hicks Lighthouse. 3 generations of his descendants were there to wish him happy birthday. Born in 1901 in Dandenong, he joined the Victorian Police as a 23-year-old. 9 years later, after serving as a mounted trooper and as a foot constable, he was asked to resign because he was allegedly living with a woman who wasn't his wife. Struggling through the Depression years, he enlisted as a private in the 16th Australian Infantry Training Battalion in 1940 and was shipped off to Palestine 5 months later. Shortly afterwards, he was reported as missing in action in Crete. He had been captured by German troops along with many other Australian soldiers and interred in infamous Stalag 13C in Bavaria, Germany. He was officially registered as a German prisoner of war in October of 1941 and remained there for the duration of World War II. Following his army's discharge in September 1945, all Christophan wanted was peace and quiet in his homeland countryside, and he got it, but not for as long as he would have liked. He became an assistant lighthouse keeper at Point Hicks Lighthouse in Victoria. His wife Daisy accompanied him, and they lived in one of 2 keepers' cottages next to the light. Apparently Point Hicks was the first site where Lieutenant James Cook of the Endeavour first sighted Australia, and he named Point Hicks after Lieutenant Zachary Hicks, who first saw the land on April 20th, 1770. The lighthouse, built 1887 to 88, stands 130 feet or 40 metres high, the tallest mass concrete lighthouse in Australia, and was first lit in May of 1890. It is believed that Old Henry met a bitter end. His daughter-in-law, Margaret Christopher, who'd married his son Robert, explained 50 years after his death that on April 3rd, 1947, Old Henry went to check the cray pots on the rocks near the keeper's cottage. It is said that Daisy went to call him for breakfast, and he said to her that he wouldn't be too far away, but he was never seen again. A search was organised but was unsuccessful. A strong swimmer, but could have been knocked out at the rocks, maybe a freak wave and he fell, drowning. It sounded like a simple tragedy, an accidental drowning. But family members years later believed there was something more sinister at play. They believed that Daisy had something to do with his death. Perhaps she wasn't happy living at the lighthouse. Although his body was never recovered, some speculate that a skull was found off the coast of New Zealand that belonged to him. Lighthouse keepers that manned Point Hicks have all said that they believed old Henry was still there, walking the 162 steps up the lighthouse's spiral staircase. And many had said that they'd seen him moving about the station. Some have also said that he's still there, polishing the brass doorknobs, opening air vents and moving tools around, going about his daily duties. The next spooky lighthouse is another one from Victoria, Split Point Lighthouse. Directly across the bay from the Commandant's residence, there were two men associated with this lighthouse. The first was George Barden, who, on his journey from the Channel Islands to Australia, broke both legs when falling from the crow's nest of the ship he was on. It is not recorded why he was up there, only that he broke both legs, and while he was recovering in Williamstown, apparently rats ate away most of his heels, which is pretty disgusting. Thank you, early Australians, for keeping record of that. Still, he was able to be a lighthouse keeper for a time. And then there was Richard Baker, who spent most of his evenings at the pub and was able to somehow scratch out a hole in the black paint at the back of the lamp, which was in line with the pub, and as the light went round, he could see it flash from his seat in the pub, allowing him to keep an eye on the lighthouse and enjoy a drink with his mates. But the ghost isn't either of these. Legend has it, an unmarried daughter of either one of these men or another, who was out in a small fishing boat with her father and thought this was the best time to tell him that she was pregnant. Apparently, the man got frustrated and upset, and for some reason, the boat overturned. The unmarried pregnant daughter drowning. Whether she was deliberately drowned or whether it was an accident, no one would ever know. There's no recorded death. But it is said that a very attractive young woman rises out of the surf below the lighthouse and calls to men on the shore to join her in the water. The accounts of some men who have almost drowned trying to rescue a woman from the waters has never ceased to amaze the locals. The next spooky lighthouse story we have is from Wollongong, New South Wales. The 138-year-old lighthouse that overlooks Belmore Basin is the haunt of two ghosts. Pilot William Edwards, who guided thousands of vessels in and out of Wollongong Harbor, and who drowned himself when his boat capsized during a storm, is said to walk the observation deck at the top of the lighthouse on stormy nights, watching out for ships in distress. His ghostly companion is George Smith, lighthouse keeper during the 1920s and 30s. Smith was a familiar figure in the streets of Wollongong during his lifetime, tall, straight-backed, even in old age, and always willing to tell anyone the story of how he lost one hand and forearm while working as a sugarcane cutter in Queensland. Wonder if he had anything to do with the mafia story we had. Every evening at dusk, George would climb the spiral stairs to light the enormous revolving lantern at the top of the lighthouse, content in the knowledge that his work was averting disaster and saving lives. He died about 60 years ago, but some say he still climbs the stairs every evening. Hollow footsteps slowly climbing upward have been heard many times, and wet footprints found on the stairs when the lighthouse had been securely locked. It is believed that William Edwards is seen but never heard, and that George Smith is heard but never seen. However, both ghosts seemed quite content to be living with each other in the old lighthouse. It is believed that the most scariest are said to be 2 Queensland lighthouses. There is a third, but we'll keep that story for another day. Not so ghostly, but more gruesome. The first spooky lighthouse is Pine Islet. Pine Islet is a single steep granite rock, just 800 metres in length, part of the remote Percy Islands group southeast of Mackay. In 1927, Pine Islet was the scene of a gruesome ceremony. The authorities decided to build a new lighthouse keeper's cottage on the island that year, and the only available flat land was a grave site. An order was obtained to exhume the singular body and relocate the grave. On the headstone it read Dorothea Mackay, wife of a lighthouse keeper who had died of cancer in 1895. When the grave was opened, the coffin was found to have rotted away. The workmen collected some loose bones, a set of false teeth, and a wedding ring, burying them some distance away. Everyone seemed satisfied with that arrangement, all except Dorothea. When the lighthouse keeper moved into the new cottage that was built over the old grave, strange things began to occur. Invisible knuckles rapped loudly on the front door. Footsteps and faint muttering, indecipherable but clearly angry, were heard inside the cottage. When the lighthouse was automated in 1980, the last lighthouse keeper, Darrell Roach, reported as saying that the last time she came around was about 18 months ago. There was a knock on the door, then footsteps through the cottage into the lounge room, and then stopped above where her original gravesite would have been. Perhaps Dorothea knew now that nobody else would be living there anymore, that the place would be abandoned, now automated. She wouldn't have anybody else walking or traipsing around her land anymore, because she was never recorded as being heard of again. 400 kilometres south of the Pine Islet is Lady Elliott Island, a lovely touristy spot with natural, beautiful attractions and some unnatural ones. On one of the tours, they take you up to a small, tiny, well-kept graveyard where there are only 2 graves, but each headstone tells a tragic story. One is the last resting place of a 30-year-old Phoebe Jane Phillips, daughter of the lighthouse keeper during the last decade of the 19th century. Phoebe lived a sheltered life on the island with only her parents for company before dying of pneumonia in 1896. The other grave is that of Susanna McKee, wife of a later lighthouse keeper. Susanna McKee came from Ballygunaway in Ireland and had 4 sons with husband Tom. Before accompanying him to Lady Elliott Island, the living conditions were harsh on the island than what she'd thought. Supplies were brought by ship and often late. Meat and other perishables would not keep. They lived in cramped living quarters, windswept and Spartan. Medical attention was unavailable. Loneliness, boredom, and the sense of isolation weighed heavily on Susanna's mind. After her youngest son went off to boarding school in Rockhampton, she decided she could stand the living conditions no longer. On the 23rd of April 1907, she put on her best dress, good shoes and her favourite hat, walked out onto the jetty below the lighthouse and threw herself into the sea. There were rumours at the time that Tom McKee had pushed his wife off the jetty, but no one could prove the murder. Tom recovered his wife's body and buried her in the graveyard beside Phoebe Phillips. But for some reason, Susanna McKee did not rest easy in her grave. The first recorded sighting of a woman fitting Susanna's description dates from the 1930s. The keeper at the time, Arthur Brumpton, looked down from the lighthouse balcony one evening and saw a female figure dressed in turn-of-the-century clothing walking between the lighthouse and the 3 cottages behind it. Arthur Brumpton had a daughter named Margaret, who also recalled feeling a strange presence of a woman around her and watching her, and stated that as a child she was worried she was always going to get thrown off the balcony. Now, the Brumptons wouldn't have known who the ghost was if it wasn't for a ship that they were travelling on, who had photos of people at different times who lived on the island. And when they saw a picture of Susanna McKee, Arthur Brumpton recognised her as the woman he'd seen from the balcony of the lighthouse. When this lighthouse became automated in 1985, the keys to the cottages were handed over to the resort manager of the touristy spot that now sits there, and they allowed a groundsman and a chef to move into the spot. They moved their furniture in and decided to take a break on a tractor parked outside the front cottage. It was a still day and no wind in the afternoon, yet suddenly an empty plastic ice cream container came flying out of the front door of one of the unoccupied cottages and landed at their feet. At dinner that evening, the pair told another workmate about the flying container and were told of the story of the mysterious footsteps. The groundsman laughed and said he didn't believe in ghosts. That night, he was hurled bodily from his bed in the cottage and landed on the floor with a bone-shaking thud. After that, he slept on the veranda. A few nights later, he woke around 1 a.m. and found to his horror that he could clearly see the transparent figure of a woman standing in the cottage doorway. She was staring at me with big, unblinking eyes. Instantly, I felt cold all over. Goosebumps rose on my skin and the hair on my arms and legs stood up like bristles of a brush. I had the strange feeling that I was fixed like a specimen on a microscope slide, and that this thing was studying me like I was some kind of freak. I was so scared I couldn't even cry out. I just lay there until the figure faded and disappeared. The ghost of Susanna McKee has also been seen peering out of the cottage windows and striding across the island's small airstrip, and not always alone. On some occasions, she has been accompanied by a young woman. Was this Phoebe Phillips? An old man was also sighted with them, wearing blue overalls. A boy wearing a Stetson hat has also been seen by staff and guests, leaning against an Indian almond tree between the 2 cottages. Mysterious bloodstains have appeared from time to time on the 4th step of the staircase inside the lighthouse, and the plaintive voice of a little girl calling out for her mother has been heard. All suggest that there are more dark secrets unrecorded in the island's history. A crank-started generator that supplied all the power to the resort in pre-solar days was housed in a locked room. Once they stopped suddenly, plunging the whole complex into darkness. But before anyone reached the locked room, they started up again. Many guests and staff heard some old kerosene tins stored in a generated room, rattling and crashing about. Teams of painters contracted to repaint the old lighthouse cottages found that every time they climbed their scaffolding, they would shake violently. Once they got down, the shaking stopped. A female guest camping alone one night woke to the sound of zippers on her tent being opened and closed. She got up, looked around, but there was no one outside. She came back into her tent and then, to her alarm, realised the zippers had been on the inside of her tent. In the bar of the resort, a glass tumbler spontaneously imploded moments after a guest finished drinking from it. That same guest had laughed as he'd swallowed the last mouthful of drink, declaring loudly that ghost stories are a load of bullshit. He said he, like many other skeptics who have stayed on the island, all now believe. The spooky stories are widely known at the tourist spot, and the tour up to the cemetery is always a favourite amongst tourists after hearing so many of the stories. It's no wonder that these spooky stories are still quite alive. And we are quite happy about that because it gives us a nice story to present to you. If you enjoyed these stories, make sure you give the video a like. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you're aware when we're posting more stories.
Man defy the she-ghost of Haunted Island. It's going to be just as though you never existed. I'm going to marry Meg.
The lighthouse is a very dangerous place, Sandy. It'll soon be torn down.
That doesn't keep people from going there.
But you mustn't go there, Sandy. Not ever. What's the matter, Fritz? All right, I'll go alone. Young lady, bye. It's no use. I know you're in here somewhere. I can hear you, too. Don't you think it's ridiculous to hide? Come down. There's something I want to say to you. Very well. If you won't, then I'll go up and find you. I don't usually give people advice, but Tom is a dear friend, and I want to ask you to leave him alone. Are you listening to me? You might at least have the politeness to answer. My, that's a nasty laugh you have. What tricks are you up to now? Stand still and let me talk to you, please. You don't belong here, you know. What are you saying? I can't hear you. What a fiend you are. You're not fooling me. I know exactly what you are.
I'll never let you marry Meg. You belong to me, Tom. You belong to a ghost. Tom Stewart killed me! Tom Stewart killed me!